You're listening to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Fish University, hosted by Dr. Wes Neal.
Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome, everybody. We're here today. We're coming from Spokane, Washington. I'm here with Dr. Steve Lochmann. We're here at the American Fisheries Society annual meeting. It happens every year, usually in the fall. It's when a whole bunch of fishery scientists from around the world get together and talk about everything that has to do with fish. Dr. Lochmann and I have worked together for, I don't know, Steve, how long has it been? 20 years?
Oh, at least.
Yeah, at least 20 years. And, we've been talking the first couple of episodes, we've been talking about how to grow big bass in ponds, but I thought we'd do something a little bit different today. We're going to talk about trophy brown trout. Steve has been working in some rivers in Arkansas where some of the biggest brown trout in the world have been grown. And he's learning a lot of cool things about them. So I think that our audience would really enjoy hearing about trout, how trout interact, and some of the factors that go into growing really big trout. So today, we're here. So we're in Spokane. We're kind of hoping for a little cooler weather, right, Steve? We're both coming from the south.
It was warmer at home than it was. It was warmer today here in Spokane than it was at home.
Exactly. We were hoping to come to the Pacific Northwest and experience some cold weather, and unfortunately, it's mid-90s and maybe getting down in maybe the upper 60s at night, which is not that refreshing compared to maybe less humidity, though.
Yes, less humidity. I agree.
Exactly. So we're here. We're learning everything about all kinds of things to do with fish. Today we watched some interesting talks on big river fisheries and from China all the way to the Mississippi River. But Steve is giving talks on the Little Red River in Arkansas. And the Little Red River, if you've never heard of it, if you're a trout fisherman, I'm sure you've heard of the Little Red River. It's a pretty famous river, isn't it, Steve?
It is. The world record brown trout came from the Little Red River at one point. It's not the world record anymore, but we've still got some very, very large trout. So if you're interested in catching some big brown trout, I think you should check out the Little Red River.
Yeah, and that world record, just for those of you who aren't really sure what a big brown trout is, it was 40-plus pounds, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
That's a big trout. If you're not familiar with trout rivers in the South, the Little Red River is what's called hypolimnetic release reservoir.
Yeah, so first of all, Wes, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
I'm excited. I'm happy to talk about this. I love talking about the Little Red River. It's been a surprising and interesting turn in my career. I didn't do a lot of trout work until about 5 years ago when the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission asked myself and my graduate students to take a look at some of the things that their anglers had raised, some issues that trout anglers in Arkansas had raised with the agency. Now, the Little Red River is a tailwater fishery. And Wes, what that means is that releases from Greer's Ferry Dam make water that used to be smallmouth bass stream into a water cold enough to get cold water fish. So back in the late 60s and early 70s, when the dam was created, water is released from very deep in the reservoir. It's cold, and it created an opportunity for Arkansas to stock trout. We don't have any native trout, but now Arkansas in that tailwater has rainbow trout, most of which are raised at state or federal hatcheries and stocked into the system. But the Little Red River is a really special place because there is a naturalized population of brown trout. Now, what I mean by a naturalized population of brown trout aren't native. They're not even native to North America. They were brought over for recreational fishing purposes, but in our stream, in the Little Red River, they reproduce enough naturally that the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission hasn't had to stock brown trout to maintain that fishery since the 70s. And because it's a self-sustaining, self-reproducing population, that doesn't happen anywhere else in the state of Arkansas. Now, we have other tailwater fisheries, and we have brown trout in those tailwaters, but those fisheries are maintained by raising brown trout in state or federal hatcheries and stocking them. That doesn't happen in the Little Red River.
They weren't originally stocked by the Game and Fish Commission. Were the anglers? Did anglers introduce them? I think I recall hearing that.
Anglers got permission. This was not an unintended introduction.
Okay.
Anglers have gotten permission. And in fact, Wes, anglers have gotten permission to stock some other trout species. Since this is not a natural system, you're not messing up nature if you're adding a trout species to the mix. So we have a small number of brook trout, which are in fact native to the eastern part of the United States. And recently, the Game and Fish Commission has allowed anglers and angler groups to even bring cutthroat trout in egg boxes and introduce them to the Little Red River. So we figure in a couple of years, there may be rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, brook trout, and brown trout. But it's only the brown trout that are able to maintain their population by reproducing on their own.
And you mentioned brook trout. Now, didn't they stop stocking brook trout in the river?
No.
No? Okay.
They are still stocking some brook trout. Anglers have a lot to say about what goes into the Little Red River. And the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission's trout program does what they can within reason when anglers ask for it. And so there are some anglers that said, we'd like to have a varied trout fishing experience. We don't want to only be catching rainbows with an occasional brown. And the Game and Fish Commission said, why not? We don't see any reason not to let you introduce some other fish. They may take off, they may not. It's too early to tell whether the cutthroat trout will grow big enough to create that fourth trout fishery in the system.
Yeah, I remember you and I fished there. I don't know, how many years ago was that?
2010?
Maybe. I remember we fished there together, and we saw one of the last holdovers of some of the earlier stocking of brook trout. It was massive. I mean, that fish was probably a state record fish, and we could almost touch it, and it was just swimming right there below us, and we could... There was nothing we could do about it.
Well, Wes, it's interesting that you mentioned seeing the fish and not being able to catch them. There are a lot of anglers in Arkansas, and they're very passionate, and they fish all the time, and they are convinced that there aren't enough brown trout in the Little Red River, that the fishery, which is self-sustaining, actually needs more regulations and more protection because it's a very tenuous fishery. And the reason that we believe they think that is because it's much harder for an angler to catch a brown trout than it is to catch a rainbow trout. The rainbow trout are raised in a hatchery. They sit in the river all day and they look up looking for food to fall on their head because that's what they're used to getting in a hatchery. The brown trout are wild and they're wily and they're smart, and they're much harder to catch. When we go out and we electrofish, we usually get about a 50-50 mix of rainbow trout and brown trout. But when you look at what an angler, the typical trout angler is catching, it's probably more like 90% rainbows and 10% brown trout. And that disconnect between what the angler's perception is and what a trout biologist sees when they go out and use standard sampling protocols is kind of one of the challenges that the state agency has to deal with because they want to keep the stakeholder happy, but the stakeholder doesn't always have all the facts at their fingertips.
Exactly. And what a lot of folks don't realize is they don't realize that with the rainbow trout, the goal, when you produce a fish to catchable size, you want every fish to get caught. And therefore, when they're putting this fish out there, these fish are put out there with the intention of they're dumb and they'll be easy to catch on everything from a marshmallow to a Joe's fly or a rooster tail or whatever, even a fly rod. They're not intended to be in the system for that long. People don't realize that. They think that they should let them go. Well, these fish don't even know how to survive a lot of times in these systems. I've caught them and cut them open, and they're full of rocks and cigarette butts because they look like pellets from the hatchery.
Well, Wes, we typically assume that most of these fish are caught within a year, but you know that some of the fish that we see when we sample, some of the rainbow trout that we see when we sample are way too big. The hatchery didn't raise them that big. So some of the occasional rainbow trout is smart enough to avoid being caught within the first 12 months. And there is some growth, but generally, you're right. The presumption is that this is what we call a put and take fishery, which means you raise them to a catchable size at the hatchery. And catchable can be defined differently depending on your management strategies. If the Game and Fish Commission wants catch rates to be high, they may raise a rainbow trout in the hatchery to 9 or 10 inches, maybe with an average of around 11 and a few of them up around 12 or 13. If stakeholders are looking for bigger fish and fewer fish, then they might be raised to an average of 13 or 14 inches in the hatchery, with some of them coming from the hatchery at sizes up to 16 inches.
Let's talk about the brown trout for a second, and what are they eating? I've heard that they're actually eating stocked rainbow trout. Is that true?
I've seen some 15-plus pound brown trout, and I don't believe for a minute that they're getting to that size feeding on caddisflies and sow bugs. So yes, I believe that there are rainbow trout, and if you look at some of the people, anglers, that target large brown trout, one of the favorite patterns of the Rapala lure to throw is what they call a rainbow trout pattern.
Oh, of course. So they used to stock so many more rainbow trout than they do now. They've sort of reduced stocking rates. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. And in the Little Red River, they get trout from federal hatcheries, but the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission gets trout from the Spring River Hatchery, which is the cold water hatchery that belongs to the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. Now, unfortunately, they had some disease issues in the Spring River, and they cut some production. They had to, unfortunately, destroy some fish, and that reduced the ability to stock in all the tailwaters on the White River, not just the one in the Little Red. Fortunately, they have invested some money. They have revitalized the hatchery in the Spring River, and their production is going up, so they should be able to stock more. But there was a second reason why the Game and Fish Commission stocked fewer rainbow trout, and that was sort of an experiment. There was a concern that the growth rates of brown trout and the growth rates of rainbow trout were lower than the stakeholders, the trout anglers, wanted to see. And there's sort of a game that fisheries managers play between numbers and size. If you aren't getting the size you want, then one of the things that you out of your fishery, and this is probably true for bass in ponds, this is probably true for trout in my tailwater, if there's too many mouths to feed and not enough food, fish will not grow as quickly. And one of the things that managers suggest is you remove some of the smaller fish so that the ones that remain have more food per mouth and they can grow. And so one of the objectives of reducing the rainbow trout stocking was to see if you would get faster growth rates both in the rainbows and in those native brown trout.
That sounds an awful lot like what we've talked about in some previous podcasts, where I always like to tell people when you want to grow a trophy bass, you need to think about carrying capacity. And let's say a pond can support 100 pounds of bass. You could have 101-pound bass or 52-pound bass or 10-pound bass, but it's only going to support 100 pounds of bass. So the same is true with trout, is what you're saying.
We believe that's true.
Yep.
We've found with our research over the last couple of years that in the tailwater of the Little Red River, growing at about, this is brown trout now, they're growing at about an inch a year. Other places with other brown trout populations, even some on the other tailwaters of the White River in Arkansas, they may grow as much as 2 inches a year. So over a period of time, you're losing a lot of growth potential with those trout. And one of the things you can do in other tailwaters where the population is not self-sustaining is attempt to stock fewer fish. You can't do that in the Little Red River because the brown trout out there are reproducing on their own. They're actually reproducing very well, and that may be creating a problem in the fishery. Now, it's really, really hard to convince a conservation-minded fly fishing trout angler to harvest trout. But in this case, taking some of those trout now and then isn't going to hurt the population, and it might actually improve the growth rate. But it's very challenging to convey that message to people who believe that every trout you catch should be returned gently to the water to be caught another day.
Yeah, because for sure, if you remove it now, it's not going to be bigger tomorrow. So that's the attitude. We have the same problem in pond management. One of the things you mentioned, though, was that you have about a 1-to-1 ratio between rainbows and browns. Now, I've been on that river, and you can practically walk across trout. So that's a lot of brown trout out there, but people aren't catching them. So you've told me so far that the angler perception that growth rates are slow is probably pretty accurate. But what about this perception they have that there's not many fish out there and reproduction is down?
Well, one of the projects that we have done is to look at reproduction. So we said that brown trout spawn on their own. For those, not everybody understands trout reproduction. It's a little different than bass reproduction or bluegill reproduction. But the trout, like bass and bluegill, are in fact a nest spawner. We call their nest a redd, R-E-D-D. That's a depression in the gravel in the river that the mama trout makes. She actually rolls over on her side and she beats her tail up and down and she suspends some of that gravel, and then the current of the river will carry that gravel downstream. So you'll get a very characteristic pit and then a tail spill or a pile of gravel below it. And when that female brown trout feels like that pit is deep enough, then a male brown trout will join her. They will spawn. So she'll release eggs, he'll release sperm. These eggs will fall in the gravel at the bottom of that pit, and then the female brown trout will move upstream slightly. By slightly, I mean, 6 to 18 inches, and she'll excavate another pit. And the gravel that comes out of that pit fills in the depression or the pit where she just laid eggs. So you get a string of egg pockets, sometimes 2 or 3, over the course of several weeks, made by the same female. Well, anglers in the state of Arkansas were concerned because this is a self-sustaining population, and they were convinced that one particular shoal produced most of the brown trout in the Little Red River. There is a walk-in access that everyone who fishes the Little Red River knows about. It's called Cow Shoals. It is one of only a few walk-in access points on the Little Red River. There's a lot of boat access, there's a lot of private dock owners, but there's not a lot of walk-in access, and that's one of them. And the presumption of these trout anglers was that that was a very important place and it needed special regulations. Wes, it already has some special regulations. For example, that particular shoal, that particular shallow area where brown trout go to spawn, you can't fish from a half hour after sunset until a half hour after sunrise. It's the only shoal in the 30-mile tailwater that has that regulation. And trout anglers were asking for even more restrictive regulations. For example, they were asking for that shoal to be closed to fishing during the spawning season, and they were concerned that too many anglers stomping around on the gravel would end up crushing the eggs that are down in the spaces between the gravel, and that it would ruin the brown trout fishery. So one of the things my graduate students did is they surveyed, which means they started at the dam and floated 30 miles. It takes about 3 days. You get about 10 miles a day. And every time they came to a shoal or shallow place where there was gravel that the trout would spawn, they'd get out of the boat and they would carefully walk along with a very accurate GPS instrument, and they would locate and count every brown trout nest in a 2-week time period. They did this from, early September until late January during the brown trout spawning season. And one of the things my graduate students and a couple of folks from the Game and Fish Commission's trout program found 2,417 nests in that 30-mile area. And about 2,300 of them weren't on cow shoals. In fact, this particular shoal that the anglers were concerned about wasn't even among the top 4 or 5 shallow places where trout spawn. There were many other places. In fact, the brown trout spawn just about anywhere that conditions are right. Now, I'm sure your listeners might wonder, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a right condition? So if the sediment, if the gravel on the bottom is too big, let's say it's the size of a grapefruit, well, it takes a pretty big mama trout to excavate a pit when the gravel is the size of a grapefruit. That's not good spawning sediment. If she excavates over sand, then the eggs can't fall and be protected in the spaces between the gravel. So good gravel, where a brown trout mama might want to dig a red, from an English pea to a marble to maybe a golf ball, if the gravel is a combination of things in that size range, then she's going to spawn there. But she won't spawn there if the water is too deep or too shallow. So if the water is between 12 and 18 inches and the gravel is just that size that I described, that's looking really good. But the water also has to be flowing at a certain rate. Now, don't ask me how the brown trout know that the water is flowing this fast. About as fast as a baby crawls. When the water is going about as fast as a baby crawls and the gravel is between an English pea and a golf ball and it's about 18 inches deep, anywhere in the tailwater that you find conditions like that, we found brown trout spawning there.
Okay, a couple of questions on that. One is you said 12 to 18 inches deep. That sounds to me like exactly where the anglers like to wade. Is that a problem?
Actually, some of the places, including some of the areas on Cow Shoals, are at base flow now. Remember, This is a regulated river system. And if in the morning when the generators are turned off, that water may be 12 to 18 inches deep. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when you've got 2 generators running, that could be under 6 feet of water. But the trout is looking for water that's in that 12 to 18 inches of depth. And part of the problem is if the water's too shallow, she's not going to feel comfortable turning herself on her side and trying to excavate a pit. If her back is out of the water and it's dry, she's not going to want to spawn where it's too shallow. That doesn't mean they don't feed in water that shallow. So there are places where the trout anglers like to fish, and yes, they're 12 to 18 inches deep when they're wading and they're fly fishing, and they do in fact catch fish in those shallow areas, but they'll also fish deeper areas or shallower areas. There's a concern, and it's a valid concern, that too much traffic on top of new reds can hurt the developing eggs. And that's actually true. There are scientific studies where people went into a lab and put some eggs in 3 inches deep or 6 inches deep or 12 inches deep, and they walked a certain number of minutes every hour or minutes every day, and you can have a negative effect on some of those reds. But one of the things we've learned, there's a lot of reds in the Little Red River. There's also a lot of brown trout in the Little Red River. So I'm personally not convinced that the occasional angler occasionally stepping on a red and maybe having some negative impact might not necessarily be a bad thing, and it certainly doesn't put the entire brown trout fishery in the Little Red River in jeopardy.
Gotcha. And now you mentioned hydrogeneration. So these brown trout are making reds that are in a foot and a half of water, but then they turn the generators on, and now they're under 6 feet of water. Doesn't flow rate go way up? Is there any risk of blowing those reds out? When is the trout making the nest anyway? Is it happening in the shallow water period?
So those are very good questions. We can't get out of the boat and walk around when 2 generators are releasing and the water is 6 feet deep. So when we're out doing red surveys, it is at what we call base flow, which really means they're not generating electricity and they're not releasing a lot of water from the dam. Our understanding, our belief is that's when the water on these reds is going to be between 12 to 18 inches, and that's probably when the mama brown trout says, this looks like a good place for me to build a red. One of the reasons that we're assuming that is because we have looked at similar studies in natural streams, not regulated streams like the tailwater below a dam, and those brown trout in those unregulated streams are picking 12 to 18 inches. And so our brown trout don't seem to be doing anything special or different than their cousins that live in a natural stream just because they live in the tailwater. But you are correct in noting that in another stream, it's going to be 18 inches for the vast majority of the time those eggs are in the space between the gravel developing, and they don't see large fluctuations in flow. Our trout see fluctuations in flow on a daily basis. Fortunately, the flows that we see most of the time when electricity is being generated may put 5, 6, 8 feet of water on top of that, but it's not flowing fast enough to disturb the eggs that are 6 to 12 inches down in the gravel. And remember, when the mama trout was done with that egg clutch, she went upstream of it, dug another pit, and buried those eggs in the water. In fact, it's kind of important to keep some flow going down into the gravel because that clean water brings in oxygen and carries away waste from the developing embryo. So we want that water to be reaching down into the spaces and bringing clean, fresh water to the eggs. I'm not going to say that you would never blow out a red, but we don't see that routinely as a problem. And the reason I say we don't see that routinely as a problem is if I have, I'm doing a red survey and it's in the middle of the spawning season. Well, my GPS tells me where all the old reds are, and we can still see the pit and the tail spill there from, reds that we identified for the first time weeks to months earlier. So if the variability in flow that we see when they turn on a couple of generators was scouring the reds and destroying them and killing the eggs, you wouldn't see the classic depression and tail spill that we see lasting weeks to months after we first noticed it.
Now, how long does it take for those eggs to hatch?
Well, those eggs are spawned in the fall and they're going to hatch in the spring.
Oh, wow.
So
they need to survive a while.
Yeah,
okay.
It takes a while.
So you're not at risk of identifying old reds, because usually if you find a red, it's probably got eggs in it, or at least during the spawning season that you're out there.
That is correct. During the spawning season, it's going to be out there. And a red is really characteristic because during much of the year, there may be algae, little plants and stuff that grow on that gravel. And one of the things that the mama does when she digs that is she's cleaning that gravel off. So as we walk along and we look out through the river, when you see clean gravel and a bit of a depression, you know that's a red. And the tools, it's not like going and buying a $90 Garmin where, it tells you where you are, give or take 12 to 15 feet. The tools that we use are accurate to within about 6 inches.
Wow.
So when my student holds the GPS over a red, it will show him that he's held that GPS at exactly that spot, and the red that he is looking at is one he's already recorded. And when he holds that GPS over one that he hasn't, we don't see a previous data point in his GPS. And that's how he keeps from double counting.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things about the Little Red River, if anyone's ever fished it, knows it has got a lot of vegetation in it. There's a lot of vegetation, and all the deep pools have very dense vegetation. Are the trout spawning in vegetation, or are these riffles just too swift for the vegetation to establish?
When we find reds, most of the time they are in relatively shallow water. And the places that you and I, if I throw out a spinnerbait and drag it over the top of a couple of pieces of vegetation, I'm usually in 2 to 4 feet of water, and that's a sandy bottom. And typically That's the wrong place for a brown trout to spawn. It's too deep, the sediment isn't right, but those are good places for that vegetation to develop. So there's probably plenty of brown trout there looking for food amongst that vegetation, but that's not where they would go to spawn. Now, occasionally you'll get good substrate, that marble to golf ball size substrate, and it's right next to or not far from a plant of vegetation. That's not something that the brown trout typically look for. So proximity to vegetation is not one of the characteristics that we look for when we look for reds. And therefore it's not really a problem. Now, there are people who have lived on the river, that have fished on the river for many, 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 many years, and they have a concern that there's too much vegetation in the river. They would, in fact, like to go back and open up some of that vegetation and do some habitat restoration and maybe even reload some of those shoals with the right kind of gravel. 2,417 reds in that 30 miles gives you a red density, or the number of reds per, and I hate to do this because it's metric, and I know most listeners don't know what a kilometer is, but 10 kilometers is 6 miles, but 48 reds per kilometer. That's the density of reds in there. There are some places in the United States where red densities are in the 2 to 6 per kilometer. But there are places in Spain and Norway where red densities are more like 90 reds per kilometer. So when someone suggests that we fix spawning, they're presuming that it's limited. And our work has suggested there's not a limited amount of spawning. There's a lot of spawning.
Sure sounds like it. So now these fish are going to this habitat. Are they moving very far?
Well, Wes, we've been doing some work that allows us to keep track of fish and to sort of keep track of where they're going and just how far they're moving. And to do this, we use something called a PIT tag, P-I-T. Now, PIT is an acronym for a passive integrated transponder. That doesn't mean anything to your listeners. But if I tell your listeners, if they got a new puppy and they took it to the vet would say, do you want me to put a chip in your dog so that if it gets lost, I can return it to you? That is the same kind of object that we put inside a brown trout. A pit tag is about the size of a grain of rice. It's encased in glass, and inside there is a small circuit. No battery, just a circuit. But just like at the vet that finds a lost dog, you wave a wand over the fish with a pit tag in it, it energizes that circuit, and that circuit gives your wand a unique alphanumeric code. So every season, summer, winter, spring, and fall, for the last 3 years, we have gone out and put about 300 pit tags into brown trout in the Little Red River. You can't see the pit tag. It's there, but you can't see it. So to help us tell the tagged fish from the untagged fish, we clip their adipose fin. Now, an adipose fin is the very small, fatty flap that you see behind a dorsal fin. The fish doesn't need it, and it doesn't mind if we clip it off. So once we put that tag in the fish, we clip that fin so that later, when we recapture that fish, we can look at it and go, oh, that's probably got a tag in it. And it helps us quickly move through. So if we catch 100 fish, lately we've been finding that anywhere from 40 to 60 of those are recaptures. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, we know that when we put the tag in, we mark the GPS location where we caught it and the date that we caught it. And later, whether later is 3 months, 6 months, 18 months, or 3 years down the road, we catch that fish and we know when the last time we saw it was. We're weighing and measuring that fish when we put the tag in and when we recapture it, and we know the time that has elapsed since then. So if we look at the difference in length and the difference in time, we can infer a growth rate. And that's how we've learned that brown trout in the river are probably not growing as fast as they are elsewhere. But the other thing you get from this pit tagging, this operation, is that we can tell how far that trout has moved between the last time we saw it and this time. And interestingly, we're finding that it is usually not more than about a half a mile away from where we last saw it, and that happens regardless of whether it's been 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a whole year since the last time that we saw it. That's amazing to me because I expected there would be a lot of movement of trout within that 30-mile tailwater. If you look at other systems that are not regulated like the tailwater, it's not uncommon to see brown trout moving upstream in the fall to spawn and then returning downstream to a summer habitat to feed or a winter habitat to overwinter. That doesn't seem to be what our trout are doing. I call them neighborhoods. Every trout in the Little Red River seems to know where its neighborhood is, and it stays in its neighborhood. I was surprised initially, but after some consideration, maybe it shouldn't surprise me that brown trout are staying where they are. A trout is going to go where it needs to go to get the things it needs to live, grow, and reproduce. If it's got food in its neighborhood, it doesn't have to wander too far to feed. If it's got deep water in the summer where it's going to stay cool, then it doesn't have to move around a lot in the summer looking for nice, cool places to chill in. And in the fall, if we're seeing good spawning habitat throughout the tailwater, then it doesn't have to move around very far to reproduce. So if it has everything that it needs in its neighborhood, why would it waste energy swimming from one end of the tailwater to the other looking for something better?
That's really interesting, Steve. So far I think we've decided that the anglers think that there aren't very many trout out there, but there apparently are a lot of trout. They are correct that they're not growing particularly fast, but one of the other complaints I've heard is that the size distribution, so the ultimate size, is going down. What's happening to the big fish?
I wish that I could take every angler who fishes the Little Red River out with us when we sample at night. Now, we see the fish, but we see them because we cheat. When we go out and we sample fish, we use electricity. We do electrofishing. I would guess that in your earlier podcast, you probably talked with people about how to assess a farm pond, and that probably includes your electrofishing boat. Well, we electrofish too. So we see a full size distribution of fish. And if I could take every angler out with me, I could show them the monsters that we find. Now, these fish are big and old and smart, and that means they're probably not being caught very much, if ever. But I'm able to post some of these pictures. So about a month ago, I was out with them, and in a 10-minute electrofishing run, we boated a 15-pound female and a 14-pound male. People swear that fish aren't that big in the river, but those of us that can cheat and sample a lot of fish know that those big fish are there. They're just wily and hard to catch. Now, I was able to post video footage of that, and I don't ever have anything important enough to say on the internet or Facebook that would go viral. But I realized that in about 2 days, about 800 people had watched that video of these side-by-side 15 and 14-pound fish, and they were just shocked at the size of these. So I'm not convinced there aren't big fish in the river. I think there are some pretty sizable fish. For me, catching a 15-pound brown trout would be the fish of a lifetime for me.
You said this was a month ago?
This was about a month ago.
So about a month awe this is not the spawning season, so I'm guessing you were sampling the deeper we
sample pools and shoals. What we try to work with the power company and the Corps of Engineers, and it's actually easier for us to do the sampling we do at night because it's easier to sneak up on the brown trout at night because they're moving around more at night. And because if we get what we call a flow request approved, that means that the power company will release just enough water that we can electrofish in places that ensure a good catch rate. So no, it's not during the spawning season, but we set up conditions so that we have access to fish when they're most available. And interestingly, night, that's when we have our success, but most people don't get out on Little Red River and fish at night. The occasional guide, and you'll see these posts when you watch Facebook, Friends of the Little Red River or Fly Fishers of Arkansas, and when you see them posting big browns, often that picture shows they're out fishing at night.
I was going to say another good reason to electrofish at night is not to have 1,000 anglers on the water when you do it.
This is true. We don't want to disturb anybody's fishing experience while we're sampling the population. And night doesn't get the kind of attention that it does during the day. But the brown trout are out moving around and feeding at night, and that gives us an opportunity to see more of the full size distribution than many anglers get the chance to see.
So the $1 million question then, Steve, is do you think there's another 40-pounder out there?
I haven't seen it yet. I think 15 to 18 pounds. And remember, I said we've been going out now for 3 years. We electrofish summer, winter, spring, and fall. We're usually out about 3 or 4 nights each season. And I haven't seen that big fish. But I have people who have been on the front end of an electrofishing boat who tell me, I just saw the new state record brown trout. I missed it. I missed it when I was electrofishing. I couldn't dip it with my net, but it's there.
That story sounds familiar, the fish that got away.
I've
heard that lie more than once, right?
Well, these are from people who are not hook and line anglers. They have no reason to exaggerate, and they're pretty good at guessing lengths and weights of fish that they see in the water.
Gotcha. Now, it's interesting. We've talked about all these different things and how the anglers have a perception versus a reality. Why do you think it is that anglers aren't catching brown trout?
There are some very specific conditions on the Little Red River that we think are conducive to catching brown trout. One of the things that we know is that as brown trout get bigger, they switch from feeding on insects in the drift to a bit more piscivorous. Now, Pisces, right? That's fish. Piscivore is a fish that eats fish. And you said earlier, I'll bet those big fish got big by eating rainbow trout. Well, that's probably true. And larger brown trout adopt a more nomadic, they're nomad, they're moving around more, and they're looking for fish to feed on. And we think that under certain conditions, the fish are going to be out and they're going to be active and they're going to be feeding more. Those conditions may not be the conditions that, say, a client wants their guide to take them out and fish during. We just did a project where we went out and hook and line caught brown trout, and we put radio transmitters in their stomach so that we could follow them around for 96 hours, for 4 days afterwards, and make sure that there was no mortality from the hook and release experience. Well, when you fish when the conditions are right, you'll catch fish. And you can fish 8 or 10 hours when the conditions are wrong, throwing exactly the same bait in exactly the same place, exactly the same way. And if conditions aren't right, you won't catch fish. So we fished for a whole day and boated maybe 2 brown trout. And the next day, the weather was going to be horrible. We knew we were going to be out in the rain. And we caught 5 or 6 fish right away that day. So, people, it's raining. I don't want to go out and fish with my guide. The fish seem to love rain. Many guides have clients who want to take them out during the day, but we believe that fishing at night might increase their catch rates. The other thing that we found, and Wes, I believe it was you who first tweaked me to this, who first said, yeah, here's when we're going to switch from maybe throwing a small spinnerbait to throwing a big jerkbait, and that's on rising water. So when the power company starts releasing water, you get a big slug of water that's moving down that tailwater, and the water is going from being 6 or 8 or 12 inches to being 6 or 8 feet. And as that water comes up, we think that's a cue for big brown trout coming out from where they're hiding and wandering around more and fishing. And we know that our luck, and I'm not an experienced enough fisherman to call it skill, but our luck at catching brown trout is probably going to go up as the water is rising. The other thing that we see is when the water is up, the brown trout aren't necessarily moving around as much, but and especially during full daylight. But when you go back out and you fish as the sun is setting, at least on the Little Red River, it's in a deep valley. And so when you start getting shadows along the edges of the river, if you throw your bait into that shadow and pull it out, well, the brown trout have moved into that shadow because it's a nice place to be. It's quiet, it's hidden, they're not seen by bird predators or anything. But you can draw them out with a good crankbait. You'd have to be on the water when the water is up and the sun is in exactly a certain position in order to have just the right shadow along the bank to be able to pull those fish out. Well, most anglers say, well, I'm on vacation and this is when I'm fishing and I can't pick the weather, I can't pick the time, I can't pick the flow conditions. I'm just out fishing when I'm at liberty to go out and fish. And they don't catch brown trout as often then or as frequently then because those just aren't the right conditions for catching big brown trout.
I know exactly what you're saying. We were up there. I took my children up to Little Red. I don't know, it's probably been 3 or 4 years. And I somehow managed to get them up at daybreak. I don't know how I did that still to this day. And got them on the water. We'd rented a boat, and we'd taken the boat out through the fog of the river, and we tied up to a tree. And I bet you we had 2 of our 3 limits of trout before the first guides showed up, because the guides, they're on the client's schedule, and the clients, they want to sleep in. They might get down there at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and it takes them a while to get in the boat. And by the time they're out there, the sun's up, it's getting hot. The water's cold because it's being released from the deep water of the lake above, but they're out there, and as soon as the waters start to come up, they don't like the conditions anymore. They think it's unsafe, and they head home. And so if they just want to catch a limit of trout, they're probably doing okay. If they want to catch a brown trout or even a big brown trout, they probably aren't there at the right time of day. I know exactly what you're saying. My favorite thing to do out there is to go out in the day and catch a limit of stocked rainbow trout for the freezer, and then go throw giant rogues or rapalas or something on the rising water and try to catch that big brown trout. You're not likely to catch it. It's very likely you might get 1 or 2 in the 18-inch range, but you always have that slim chance in the back of your head that that 15, 16-pounder is going to bite.
Wes, my graduate student, Mr. Derek Owens, who has spent an enormous amount of time on the tailwater in the last 3 years. He is recognized as he goes by doing his work by the dock owners. He calls that generation water. So yes, brown trout bite really well on the rising water. So when you turn on the generator and that big slug of water comes by, but he believes that one of the ways of catching more big brown trout is to follow that generation water. So at a time when a lot of people are uncomfortable being on the water because the water is moving pretty good, when you got 2 turbines generating electricity, that water is moving along pretty well. But that's when Derek likes to just float with that water past everything and fish for big browns in what he calls generation water. And a lot of people, weekend anglers, people who are first-time anglers on the water, that's scary for them They want to get off the water and fish from the bank or fish from a dock when that much water is flowing.
Yeah, I can see that as being frightening to someone who's not comfortable around the water. Certainly, if you're out there, you need to be wearing a life jacket because that water's cold and it's moving fast. I mean, if you've ever seen a river come up 6 feet in a course of what does it take? Maybe an hour to reach?
Yeah, sometimes
flow?
it comes up on you when you don't expect it. For example, and I'll tell you a funny story. It's funny now because it had a happy ending, but the graduate student, Derek Owens, was out on Cow Shoals, this shoal that everybody was thought was important, and he was doing a red survey, and the water started coming up, but he wanted to finish his count on that shoal, and he was on the far side, and when he turned around to wade back across the river, he realized that water had gotten too deep and too fast, and he was stuck on the wrong side of the river. He called my office, and we had to send a boat down from an access point above, and it took a couple of hours to go get him and move him from the left bank to the right bank of the river so that he could get in his car and come home. It's a unique system. I consider it very special, but it is also a system where you have to pay attention to what's happening with the water. Now, the Corps of Engineers and the power company are very good about publishing what they expect the generation schedule to be. So they can sort of tell you, all right, we're going to turn the turbines on at 1 o'clock. We're going to turn one turbine on, and at 2 o'clock, we're going to turn the second one on. It takes someone who knows the river very well to try and figure out how long it's going to take that water that they're releasing to move downstream to where you're fishing. People call that river calculus, and I can't do it in my head, but a good guide or a good angler knows, okay, I'm wade fishing right now, and it's all good, but I've got 45 minutes to an hour left, and then I'm going to have to get off the water because it's going to come up because they started generating.
So what I'm hearing here, Steve, is I think that you have told the anglers not only where to fish and how to fish, but also that they need to be keeping some fish. It's a good idea to keep at least what you're legally allowed to keep. What are the regulations right now?
So there's a 5-fish limit, and one fish can be over, and I want to say I think it's 18 inches. Okay, that can be a combination of rainbow, brown, or brook trout. And the one that's over 18 inches can be any one of those fish. So you could go up. If you were very good, you might catch 5 brown trout. I don't come across too many people that catch that many browns, but you could harvest all 5 brown trout. A while ago, I was talking, not long ago, a couple weeks ago, I was talking to a fly fishing group, and I got asked that very question, which is, okay, Steve, you think the growth rates are low, and you're telling us that maybe if we harvested brown trout, that their growth rate would go up. How many brown trout should I harvest in order to get that growth rate from 1 inch to more like 2 inches? I told him then, and I'll tell you now, I don't know how many brown trout you would have to harvest to get the growth to be better. There are ways that we could model and guess that. I don't have a solid answer, and I would hate to say, I know that if you kept every other brown trout that you caught in a year's time, we would have growth rates at 2 inches and you'd start getting bigger brown trout. I'm afraid I'm just not smart enough right now to know the answer to that question. We'll be working on that. We're actually continuing to work on brown trout in the Little Red River. And one of the questions that when the public asks a scientist a question that they don't know the answer to, that's really exciting for the scientist because the scientist loves puzzles. And that question is a puzzle. So, Wes, I don't have an answer for you. I can't tell you how many. It just seems to us that bioenergetics, the study of calories and energy that flows through the system, suggests that if they're growing slow, and there's a lot of them, having fewer fish and more food per fish should result in faster growth rates.
Well, Steve, thanks for coming today. We've been talking with Dr. Steve Lochmann, University of Arkansas Pine Bluff, trout extraordinaire and expert. Steve, I actually have one more question before we finish up. I saw a presentation that you gave recently, and you had what I consider to be one of the best-looking river maps you've been creating of the Little Red River. Are you planning to offer that to people?
Well, that map is part of the research that we've been doing, and it's one of the reasons that Derek hasn't graduated yet. Is he is mapping the sediment on the entire tailwater, and because he will have that, people's concerns about whether there is a sufficient amount of spawning habitat and whether sedimentation has become a problem in the river. In the future, we should be able to repeat the studies that we did recently to know whether there is erosion and sedimentation problems and whether that's limiting spawning habitat and what that might mean for management strategies moving forward. And yes, the data belong to the state of Arkansas. It was the Game and Fish Commission that funded it, and we will give them those data. But you better bring a big thumb drive because there's a lot of data going into that map of the sediment in the Little Red River.
Sounds great. Well, Steve, thank you so much. Really enjoyed having you here today and learning about the river. And for anyone interested in the river, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, they have a lot of resources online, so you can always check it out. And if you have the opportunity to go fish in Arkansas, it's a great state. The fishing is incredible. I miss it a lot. I used to live there for about 5 years, and I don't get back nearly enough. So, Steve, thanks for being here today.
Well, Wes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I would encourage any of your listeners who wanted a really special experience in a special place to come up to the Little Red.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.
People and wolves.
Yeah, we go way back.
Thousands of years, in fact. But our relationship with Canis lupus is complicated.
And he spent his first years up there throwing poisoned horse meat out of planes and aerial gunning wolves in the middle of freaking nowhere in Alaska. He goes, it was completely insane.
The controversy and conflict is on the human side. It's human values, it's human disagreements.
The wolves came in and pushed the night fence down into the sheep. I think that was the one day I cried last summer.
In order to solve a problem, you first have to be able to have a conversation with people. You have to build a relationship which builds trust. Then maybe you can solve the problem.
And so, how did we get here?
And where are we going to go from here?
We're about to find out.
Welcome to the Working Wild University.
Or Working Wild U for short.
This show takes you out into the field, forest, and range to meet people and wildlife of the American West. So today, we're sitting here in Red Lodge, Montana, Big Sky country.
The last best place.
And here, practical solutions almost always come from a place of deep curiosity.
So on Working Wild U, you'll hear immersive stories that ground you in place and at the crossroads of culture and science.
These stories focus on the challenges and successes of managing working wild landscapes. That's farms and ranches.
I'm Jared Beaver, Assistant Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist at Montana State University in Bozeman.
I'm Alex Pugh, the Working Wild Challenge Coordinator at Western Landowners Alliance. I live on my family farm in Powell, Wyoming, just 80 miles east of Yellowstone. My neighbors are some of the people that have bumper stickers. Welcome to Wyoming. Now take a wolf and go home. And on this podcast, we'll figure out what that really means together.
So buckle up. Alex and I will be your guides on this journey to explore the complex problems
and solutions
impacting people and wildlife of the American West.
I would like to be able to know how many wolves we are dealing with, and I would like to have tools in my toolbox beyond what I currently have.
Work on building the trust and the relationships where we're not just at each other's throat around wildlife management. And we get this pendulum, and it's not just the wildlife that loses, it's all of us.
We have to learn how to manage our operations so that we can still be sustainable. And, that means economically sustainable also.
So if you like win-wins and you're passionate about open spaces, wild places, and healthy communities,
you're not going to want to miss this.
be sure to subscribe to Working Wild You wherever you listen to podcasts. And we're really excited about what we have for you.
We'll see you there.